This is Teacher's Talk Radio, and you're listening to the Sunday Twilight Show with Maud. It is 5 p.m. on Sunday, the 14th of May, 2023. You can join me using the chat function, and we can discuss today's topic, which is property in education. Welcome! Good afternoon, fellow educators and dear listeners. I am your hostess. This is my 37th radio show, and I'm delighted to share this exciting experience in your company. But first, I have to introduce myself for any potential new listener. I am Maud, French citizen of French and West African ancestry. I have lived in the United Kingdom since 2008, and I'm a professional educator working in a secondary state school in North London, where I teach both humanities and languages, French and Spanish, and also history and geography. I also have experience as a teacher in the charity sector. You can follow me on Twitter at ProfProfMFL. All views are my own. So today, I decided to talk about something which is a very important topic in everybody's lives, which is property. And I thought it was an important topic to mention in an educational context because it is rarely put together. So today's topic is property in education. This is mostly relevant to anyone who lives and works in the UK, parents, students, staff, people working in the education sector as a whole, and also people who rent, want to buy a property, or sell one. Property. It's a term that derives from the French and Latin. It has two meanings. First, it's the quality or nature of a thing, and also an attribute such as the property of this element is. It became the notion of ownership during Roman times after Julius Caesar, but originally it comes from French into English in the 1300s. It is nature, quality, distinctive character present in an individual or a class. Now, nowadays, that meaning is usually used when we talk about a subject. The property of mercury is, for instance, in science. But when you see it in social media or online or in the media, it usually refers to ownership of a building or land. Now, there's a very famous proverb in English, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. It says that an Englishman's home is his castle. What does it mean? Well, it means that British people believe they have the right to do what they want in their own home, and that other people or the state should not interfere in their private lives and in their property. So there's a very strong sense of property as ownership in the UK, and you can see it by just checking on what you can see as documentaries are concerned or TV reality. There's a plethora of shows that deal with buying a property, whether in the United Kingdom or abroad. I'm mentioning a few: location, 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 or a place in the sun, etc. It is a very important endeavor for any families in the UK to hope to buy a property. Now, it used to be the norm before the 2010s, and now it seems like property rates are falling in new generation. So young people are less likely to become home owners. Where does the expression an Englishman's home is his castle come from? You know, I do teach history and I love a bit of history. So this is an old case from the 17th century. It's called the Semains case. In 1604, there was a court case. Richard Gresham and George Beresford were joint tenants. They lived together in a house in Blackfriars in London. Sadly, Beresford died and he was in debt. He owed money to Peter Simen. Peter Simen then tried to get possession of the late Beresford's goods in order to cancel the date. The goods were located in the house, but Gresham was not allowed to go into the house to collect the property. The sheriff offered to break into the house, and Simen sued because he thought that he couldn't get access and he wanted to get the losses from Gresham. So the court case ended up with something that is still very much in the mindset of people in the UK. It said it is not a felony for a man to defend his house to the death. Sheriffs may break and enter to recover real estate. Sheriffs may break and enter on the king's business after a request for entry is refused. Sheriffs may enter when the door is open. The householder's privilege does not extend to strangers or their goods, and the sheriffs should request entry in civil cases. So, this laid out the law, and it's still commonplace nowadays. But what we need to remember is the judgment words. So the judge said, in all cases when the king is party, the sheriff, who represents authority, may, if the doors are open, break the party's house either to arrest him or to do other execution of the king's process, if he cannot otherwise enter. But he ought to signify the cause of his coming and to make request to open the doors. And further down in his announcement at court, the judge said, the house of every one is to him as his castle and fortress, as well for his defense against injury and violence as for his repose. So the notion of ownership is inscribed in the law, and it is a very important aspect of British culture. Ownership is really important in the UK. Now, you're going to say, but what has it got to do with education? Well, if you dig deeper into the meaning of property, you can see that the way property is owned in the UK is very specific. For any newcomer or anyone who's not a British citizen, it is really important to understand the terms of leasehold and freehold. What is a leasehold property? Well, a leasehold property means that you can buy a flat or a house in the UK, but you do not own the land it sits on. The land is owned by someone else. So when you buy this house or this flat, you purchase the right to occupy this flat or this house for a certain amount of years. But after these years have passed, you need to pay a certain amount of money for the lease. So you're basically renting the land even though you own the bricks on it, because the land is owned by someone else, and this person is a freeholder. Now, before the noughties, leasehold properties were usually flats, but more and more properties sold in the UK are leaseholds, and not just flats, but also houses. So how long is the lease for? Well, usually the lease should be longer than 90 years. And when it is below 80 years, the property is not so valuable because it needs to be renewed, and you never know how much added cost renewing the lease will be. So there is a rule in the property market. If you look for a house or flat to buy that is leasehold, you need to check if the lease is more or less than 80 years. If it's less than 80 years, you should not bother trying to buy this property and look for another property with a longer lease. It is difficult to renew the lease, and it might be very expensive, which is why the 80 years limit is very important for anyone likely to purchase a flat or a house. Now, in most other countries in Europe, you can buy a house or a flat, and once you've bought it, the land it sits on belongs to you. Obviously, there might be differences in the amount of land you own in depth. For instance, I think in France, if you find something deep down underground in your property, you don't always own it. So if you found petrol, or if you found golden coins from the medieval times, they might not be yours because they're deep underground. That is a different issue. In England, you can find properties where you can own the land it sits on, and that's called freehold. Now, someone who owns the freehold of a property owns it, and it's for an unlimited period, even if a house doesn't stand on the land anymore. So, you have rights when you're a freeholder, and since the Civil Aviation Act of 1982, what comes above your house is also under your control, which is airspace. And this is why drones are not allowed to fly above houses. Now, if you are familiar with the United Kingdom's history, you will know that it is a monarchy. Obviously, you know that because we've just had the coronation. But what you might not know is that most of the land in the United Kingdom is owned by very few numbers of people. If you want to know who owns the land around you, you need to check a website. It's the Land Registry Office. You need to pay a certain amount of money to subscribe, and then you can access records and archives. But nothing is recorded before 1925, so some pieces of land are not recorded on the land registry. Why? Because this land has been in the same hands for centuries, and because it hasn't been sold, there was no papers of ownership needed. It's only compulsory now, since the current registration system was introduced in 1925, and it has to be, if you sell it again, it has to be recorded at the Land Registry Office since 1998. But if the land stays in the same hands, it doesn't. So there is a great website if you're interested in knowing who owns the land in the UK, and it is whoownsengland.org. Check it out. There is a map that has been designed by a woman, and she wanted to show how many land is secretly owned. There is no transparency and no public record of who owns this land. You're going to say, what is the problem with this? What if someone owns the piece of land next to my house? That doesn't influence me. That doesn't concern me. Well, this is a problem. Lord Coleraine, who is a Conservative peer, stated at the House of Lords in 1996 that unregistered land carries an anomalous privilege of privacy. Furthermore, the Royal Town Planning Institute also explains that this secrecy and this absence of transparency causes problems. Land registration is extremely important for a number of reasons, including facilitating strategic development, developing environmental management at a landscape scale, and also the issue of transparency. According to the Royal Town Planning Institute, in order to successfully manage land use, we need to know who owns it. So there is definitely an issue of transparency as far as land ownership is concerned in the United Kingdom. So the lady who designed this whoownsengland.org map is Anna Powell Smith. She's someone who is really into coding and writing. And she says that around 15% of the freehold land in England and Wales is not registered, not recorded, and we can't access the information as to who owns it. It is really difficult to get this piece of information. This situation is odd, and it is also harmful because it leads to some gaps in our knowledge, and some people could also benefit from it. So how many million of acres is that? 15%. Because the UK is an island. It's not a huge territory, but it's still a lot of land. It corresponds to 5.2 million acres of England and Wales territory that hasn't got an owner's name recorded. Now, Who owns this land then? And if we don't know who owns it, is there an owner? Yes, there is. The owners are usually families who've been owning this land for hundreds of years, and also the Church of England and some other corporations. As I mentioned earlier, the United Kingdom is a monarchy. It is still a feudal system with an aristocracy. If you look at the land as a whole, half of England, which is 50%, is owned by less than 1% of the UK population. This is data that has been shared in The Guardian in an article published on Wednesday, the 17th of April 2019. The journalist is Rob Evans. The secrecy in land ownership in the UK concerns 25,000 landowners. They are usually members of the British aristocracy, a few are corporations, and yet they have control of half of the country. A book was published by Guy Shrubsole entitled Who Owns England? In his book, Guy Shrubsole declares that most people remain unaware of quite how much land is owned by so few. A few thousand dukes, baronets, and country squires own far more land than all of Middle England put together. So if you thought that Pride and Prejudice felt a little bit old-fashioned, it is still very much the case. There is a few dukes, baronets, and country squires who still own most of the land in the United Kingdom. Guy Shrubsole says in his book, the aristocracy and gentry still own around 30% of UK territory, particularly England territory. This might also be an underestimate because 17% of the land is still undeclared by the land registry. We believe that most of these owners are aristocrats because their lands has been in their families for hundreds and hundreds of years. Because they do not sell this land on the open market, they do not have to record it at the land registry. So we do not have access to the knowledge, and there is not an accurate database of land and ownership in England and Wales. If half of England is owned by 25,000 landowners, less than 1% of its population, this is divided into categories. According to Guy Shrubsole, author of Who Owns England, 30% of land ownership has remained largely unchanged in the hands of the aristocracy and the gentry. 18% is also owned by corporations, 17% by oligarchs and city bankers, 17% is unaccounted, as we said, it is not registered. And who else owns the land? Well, homeowners are 5%, not that many. Conservation charities, 2% of the land. The Crown and the royal family, 1.4%, so not that much compared to the 30% of the gentry. And 0.5% of the UK land is owned by the Church of England. So now this leads me to the topic of the day, which is property and education. Who owns the land on which the schools are built? Well, public sector owns 8.5% of the UK land, which is a very little amount. The problem that we're going to devise today is that this land is slowly moving from public ownership to corporation ownership. The property market in the UK is a little bit of a national sport. And just like some of the most famous national sports, such as basketball or football, it is quite a corrupt field. It is very emotional. People are really into their national sport and the property market. It is an essential good, unlike you would say sports, and it is a very complicated field to maneuver. So the property market is definitely integral part of the British identity. Now, what is the impact of land ownership on education? It has a very direct impact, and if you're a parent and if you've ever looked at house prices near a good school, you are very much aware of what happens in the UK market. Prices for houses near a good school or an outstanding school can be over 18,000 to 20,000 pounds more expensive than the average property price in England. The new figures from the Department of Education, the DfE, show that prices are 8% higher near the best performing state schools and 6.8% higher near the best secondary state schools. So 8% for primary, 6.8% for secondary. This data is also used by real estate advisors and developers. I'm quoting data I've taken from Strutt and Parker, who are real estate advisors. According to Strutt and Parker real estate advisors, catchment areas matter for the property market. The new figures show that the top 10% of primary schools in London can increase home prices by up to £38,000, while the average across England for homes near good primaries is 18,000 and 15,000 for good secondary schools. So what does it mean? It means that if you are lucky to own your home and the school next to you is rated as outstanding by Ofsted or good, your house might be worth more money than a similar house a few miles away next to a school that is rated requires improvement. Properties near a good school are seen as valuable by people who are looking to invest their money, and they sell faster. Because there will always be parents who would like to have their children go to a very good school. These properties become very attractive, not just because of the schools, but also because of the lifestyle. If you can afford to buy a house near a good school, you're more likely to have neighbors who have children. There will be a very family-friendly community spirit and atmosphere, and you will also be more likely to be in a thriving community where people are like-minded. You might get into school-run traffic, but it's a little disagreeable inconvenience. So it is noted by Strutt and Parker on their real estate advice website that a change of head teacher can really affect the Ofsted rating. So you might have bought a house near an outstanding school. You might have seen the value of your house go up, and then if the school gets a poor Ofsted result, your house value might go down. So it is a very fluctuating market, and it is something that deals with power and money. So what is the impact of this on schools? There is a special interest between property prices and school governing bodies, because it is in the interest of the school to be popular, to be sought after, and to have a very good, outstanding Ofsted report. And it is also in the same interest for the local property agents, because if there is a lot of good schools in the area, property agents will make more money. So how does it translate in a school? Well, you have what you could call innocent sponsoring. I'll give you an example. If you do a quick Google search or network search, you will see that schools are really proud to show their connections with the local property agents. I found on a website Dawson's, which is a school, Newton Primary School in South London, that has a sponsorship with Dawson's, which is a property agent. And they say that the estate agent donated £250 towards their summer fair. And the head teacher was saying, it was in July 2016, they were saying, I quote, "We are delighted to be sponsoring this year's school's fair, and Dawson's believe the link we have within our communities is paramount to our business's success. So therefore, we make a conscious effort to support local events. So that was a quote from the owner of the property agent. And then the head teacher said, "We are very grateful for Dawson's continued support and sponsorship for this summer fair." So you see, there is a symbiotic relationship between the property agent, who is happy to donate some funds, and the schools, because if the school gets some sponsoring money, the school can invest in its building or in its office or in its library or in its computing room, and then it will attract more families, and then possibly it will make a better Ofsted rating, and then the property agent will benefit because house prices will go up in the local area. So far, so good. That seems like a symbiotic relationship. But what about influence? I'm going to explain what happens in some schools that I've witnessed in my experience as a teacher and as a parent. Some primary schools are very intermeshed with property agents to the point that they create arrangements. For instance, the school has a bit of space that is underdeveloped on its land, but it doesn't have budget to repair it or to create a new building. What is the school going to be? The school might fundraise, or they might also approach local property agents. Local property agents might see a beneficial investment opportunity. They will donate money to the school in order to repair a building or to build a new building. And in exchange, the school will advertise the use of the building for commercial reasons through the property agent. This is all legal, but what about the influence that it gives on the school governing body? To me, there's issues of conflicting interests at play. Property agent can fund the school's projects, but what if some of their family members are part of the school governing body? When does it stop becoming just a simple sponsorship and it becomes a form of nepotism or conflicting interests? School buildings have been pushed to be used for creating rental income in the last 15 years because of budget cuts. This is a governmental choice, this is a governmental decision, but it affects school budgets. We have schools who have decided to sometimes use land or buildings that they possess in order to create a rental income. Is this beneficial for the students? In my experience, I have seen buildings that were underused and underdeveloped that were transformed, but not into school storage or new classrooms. No, they were turned into flats that was then advertised via the property agent's website, and they were usually given to teachers who could rent them. Who benefits in this situation? Is it the students? Is it the school? Is it the property agent? Is it all three? I'm not sure. What does the law say? Well, you can check on the government website, gov.uk, on the section Good Estate Management for Schools. There is a responsibility for schools and school governing bodies to meet educational goals. The goals are to avoid poorly maintained schools, to make sure the buildings are safe, to make sure there is well-designed facilities that improve attainment, to make sure the school budget is sustainable, to make sure that expenditure and revenue generation allow the school to thrive financially. There is also a requirement for repairs and maintenance to prevent loss of facilities and to save money. And there is also the idea that a well-maintained school will make it more attractive to pupils and staff. What are the risks when a school is not able to manage its land or its buildings properly? Well, poor estate management can lead to inefficient use of resources and poor investment decisions. It can lead to, in extreme cases, risk to the safety of the users, risks for the children, and risks for the staff. It can also lead to teaching areas being taken out of service. And if you scroll on Twitter sometimes, you can see pictures of teachers who have to resort to using buckets because there's a roof that's leaking. And obviously, if there's water spills, the students can't use this area and it becomes condemned in the building. If there's poor estate management, there will be disruption to the day-to-day running of the school. And in extreme cases, again, whole or part school closures might be the end results. This can affect morale, staff retention, recruitment, and pupil numbers. In order to provide a good service, schools have to have a clear plan and a vision. Their estate vision is what are they going to do in the near 5 years, in the next 5 years? What budget do they need to achieve it? And how can they sustain, maintain, and not waste their resources in the building? Who makes these decisions? Who makes this estate vision in a school? Well, it's the local authority or other education providers, community groups who can have an influence, property agents, as I mentioned earlier, but at core, it's the executive leader who is responsible for the estate vision of the school. So it is the head teacher, it is the school governing body, and if it's a part of a trust, it is also the CEO of the trust and the board members. Who should be involved in these decisions concerning the buildings and the land use? Well, I believe, and I strongly believe, it should be the people who are users. Who uses school buildings and school land sites? Well, teachers, this is their workplace. They spend decades on the building, in the building and on the land. Students who spend up to 5 or 6 years in the buildings every day, 5 days a week. Parents, particularly in primary school, might pop in and out if they need to help or if they need to attend lessons with their students or if they do voluntary work. And then there is also the community. The school might be let every Saturday mornings to a language school or to a football club. So it involves a lot of stakeholders who do not have a say in the decisions that are made on the land use and on the building. In order to have an educational vision concerning the property they use, the stakeholders, and by that I mean the governing body and the head teacher, have to have a vision for the next 3 years. And they have to make sure that all the building on the estate are safe and fit for purpose. They also have to make sure that there's necessary space and facilities to welcome all the students. We can imagine the difficulties for the business manager in a school to be able to fill in all these requirements with budgets that are shrinking year on year. As a result, there is often a push to sometimes diversify the income of the school, and using the land can be a way to diversify the school's income. I'll give you an example. Instead of creating a dance room to offer GCSE dance for the students, I have seen spaces that were devoted for community users who are not teachers or students. I have seen schools that had built-in squash courts. None of the students played squash and none of the teachers played squash. The squash court was being built in order to get extra income for the school. It was going to be rented and let to members of the public. You might think it's a good use of the school facilities, but there's a lot of issues when you let the building to the public. I'm going to give you an example. I work in a Saturday French school every Saturday morning, and we are sharing a school we have access to a few classrooms and we're sharing it with a football club. It is really good because it allows children to use the building. It's not the children who attend the school in the weekdays, because these are private schools or clubs. These are people who pay a fee to use the school facilities to offer school clubs. Now, the problem is sometimes we do not have the same level of safeguarding and safety because we do not always have the keys. I'll give you an example. If someone needs to access the defibrillator, it is locked in an office and we do not have the key. So there is an issue about safety and safeguarding. Sometimes we do not have the keys to lock also the entrances to the school when we are letting it or renting it on a Saturday morning. So anyone could come into the school. Whereas if we were school users from Monday to Friday, we would have a system to lock all the doors. So it is not always the safest option for the users. The estate strategy should describe the plan. So if a school has an estate strategy, it needs to be on a 3 to 5 year medium or long-term plan. They need to make sure that they have examined all the options for their needs, that they have identified all the issues they might encounter, and that they have a framework for property-related decision. They might need to appeal to um, lawyers in order to get permission to change things on the estate, and they might also need to have the local authorities' consent and approval, and they need to have outcomes and timescales. Building schools and their impact. So, as I said before, we need to always have in mind that the school users should be at the center of any estate plan or estate vision. Will there be an impact on the way the school operates if we change the use of the building or of the land? Will the changes cause problems with the layout? Will we lose existing facilities? And does it reflect the current and future needs of the curriculum? These are very, very important questions. I'll give you an example. If a school chooses to build a new building, they have to follow, obviously, regulations and guidelines. But are they planning to allow enough land in order to provide access to nature for the students? If budgets are low and schools' income needs to be diversified, we might be tempted to overbuild on the land that is given to the school by the local community, and we might not allocate enough access to nature for students who are deprived of it already. So these are very difficult questions. Will the local community benefit from the new changes to the school? Are the expectations clearly understood by all the people who are going to be concerned? And do plans elaborated by the school governing body or the head teacher support wider educational needs in the area? My main issues with the way we deal with land and school buildings in education is that a lot of new school buildings reflect this obsession we have in education since the 90s of mimicking the corporate world. If you look at school buildings, you will notice that more and more they look like corporate buildings: concrete, glass, and metal. There is not enough concern for the environmental impact of these buildings, and not enough concern on the environmental impact on the students and the teachers who use it. A lot of decisions are made by people who have short-sighted visions. I'll give you an example. In a school I worked at, they chose to allocate most classrooms on one floor to create more science labs. There were already enough science labs, but they really wanted to push STEMs, so science, engineering, technology, and maths, to the detriment of all the other soft subjects, as they're called, aren't they? Such as drama and humanities and art. And the result is that they used classrooms that they made them too big. They took two humanities classrooms to build one lab, and uh, there's so much space in that room that the students who are at the far end of that room can't even see the digital board at the front. And there is an underuse of this classroom because of its layout. This was a very costly initiative, and the end result is that it's not serving the community. So I think there is an issue in the decision making, in the long term planning, and also there is not enough opportunities for users to give their opinion before decisions are made. A big issue in most inner city London schools is direct access to nature. If you look at the way our students live, they are living in flats, a lot of them. Once they come out of the flat, they end up going to a school building. The school playground is paved over or concreted over, and the children never actually are in nature, never able to breathe the smells of petrichor, of soil, of trees, of bark, of grass, and then they go home at the end of the day. This is not healthy. We know there's an increase in mental health issues, and yet when we see what land where we build schools is used for, it is usually not with a thought for the environment and for this access to nature. I'm going to ask you if in the schools you've been to as parents, teachers, or students, was there enough space for you to have a little vegetable garden patch? Is that important, a vegetable garden patch? I believe it is. I believe a lot of our students are not aware of how to grow vegetables. They've never even planted a seed in the ground. It is highly educational for our students to be able to do some gardening, having a gardening club, or even having enough space to grow tomatoes that can be used to make pizza in food technology. And yet, in school buildings and school plans and estate visions by schools, there is very rarely any thoughts given to land use for growing food, food that could be consumed in the premises. So this is, as you see, when we talk about property of land and buildings that are used in the educational sector, we open up a Pandora box with lots and lots of very crucial issues that we very rarely develop and describe in medias. So that's a lot of food for thought. Let's listen to the news and then we get back to the nitty-gritty of property in the education sector. Let me play the news. I'll try again. Well, dear listeners, I'm afraid my news don't seem to be playing, so I'm just going to skip to my next issue. We'll try again for the news. Now, when we talk about land, you might ask me, who owns the land most schools are built on? Well, originally, it used to be us, you and me, the taxpayers, via the local authority. Most schools, I'm only talking about state schools today, I'm not talking about private schools because they are completely different. So most state schools had buildings built on land that was owned by us, the people, and it was managed and regulated by the local authority. Now, as you're aware, since the 90s, we've done Major's idea of creating academies. We have slowly transferred ownership of schools into the hands of organizations that are called academies or trusts. These are not for profit corporations, but they are rather secretive in the way they operate. The land still belongs to the local authority, but we have no system in place to go from an academy back to a maintained school status. It has never been done. So since the year 2001, when the first academies opened in North London, a Great City School Academy, for instance, we have had a big wave of creating academies, but we don't really know what will happen in the near future as far as land ownership is. Will it still be in the hands of the local authority after a few decades? Will it be given to these trusts? We don't really know what the future holds. What we know is that we have to be wary of it because 80% of secondary schools are academies or free schools as of January 2022. 80%. And all these schools are now under the thumb of trusts or groups of people, governing bodies where the decisions are made without asking the users, students or teachers, or even parents. And for primary schools, it is 39% of these schools. So, as I said, in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the land and the schools still belong to the local authority. But in England, with the academy model, the lines are blurred. Academies receive funding from the government, but they operate without the oversight or the control of the local authority. They are free to make their own decisions. So let's explain it. If you have a land and a school is built on it, and then the school becomes an academy, the people who run this academy could decide to build something on the land, and they would just ask permission, and they could be free to decide. But there is no control from the local authority. Now, obviously, it depends on the school status. There are still community schools, and these ones, the land and premises and the buildings, are under the control of the local authority. But academies are more free. They usually were given 125-year leases, so they have to deal with that lease. But it's a long time, 125, isn't it? And the landlord remains the local education authority. But some academies may also have a different status, and they might even own freehold of their school. Now, I'm using sources from a law firm, and I'm quoting Bill Butler, who is a partner at a law firm. The law firm is called Brackers. It's an award-winning law firm that provides legal support to individuals and companies, and they have a whole section on property and investment. It's a very old firm, Brackers. It was founded in 1895, and it's celebrated its 125th anniversary. Funnily enough, it's as long as a leasehold for an academy, 125 years. So, what does Bill Butler, a law firm worker, says about schools and trusts? Well, schools are able, and academies are able to sell their land. They are also able to sell their playing fields or playground. They are able to exchange land in swaps. They can buy land. They can mortgage land. They can lease the land themselves. They can also lease it to someone else. They can give up part of their academy lease, as it's called a surrender, and they can merge with other academies. They can join multi-academy trust, and they can pool their land and buildings together in a process. So they are very free. They were given public-owned land, and now, because of that 125-year lease, they are quite free to do all these actions without anyone being able to really have a look at it. Now, obviously, they need permission. There is still the rule of law. And the permission is given by the Secretary of State for Education. the local authority and the trust within the academy. They need to follow the same rule as anyone who buys land and wants to build something on it. They need to ask the planning authority and they need to get authorization. They need to follow regulations for buildings, etc., etc. But still, can I remind you that they were given public land and now they can sell it, lease it, buy more. They can install major plants and equipment. They can establish a new academy. They can make structural alteration to buildings. They can build on school playing fields or playground, construct new buildings, and give third parties rights over the land. So if they're well intentioned, they might build a little vegetable garden patch on the school land. They might build a swimming pool for the use of the students in the week and lease it for a swimming club at the weekend. But what if they're not so well intentioned? What if they decide to build something that's not particularly educational on the land? What if they decide to build more buildings on what used to be a playing field or a playground? Well, by law, they're able to do so. And this is the problem with land ownership in the UK, is that there has been a trend and a movement to use publicly owned land and to concede it and give it to organizations that are not for profit in their status, but that behave very much like any other corporate organizations. They are not transparent, they are secretive, and they do not always serve the interest of the community. So, if you're a school within a multi academy trust, you obviously are a legal entity and it's called the MAT Multi Academy Trust. And you have legal responsibility and you must fulfill that responsibility within a framework of rules. But still, most academies have 125 years lease. So they have a lot of control on what used to be local authority land, which is taxpayers' land. Now there's peppercorn rent lease. What does that mean? That means that an academy trust can rent the land on a long-term basis at near zero cost from a landowner such as a local authority. So this is the arrangement that most academies have with the local authority. But they can also apply for a commercial lease or an outright purchase of land. So, according to the House of Commons Education Committees that was observing academies, in its report dated 2016, the Multi Academy Trust report, it is called, they said, and I quote, there remained a high degree of uncertainty around the effectiveness of multi academy trusts, and there is not yet the evidence to prove that large-scale expansion would significantly improve the school landscapes. You can check that report, it's online. It's dated from 2016, Education Committee Multi-Academy Trust Report from the House of Commons. So we have, after a decision made by John Major in the 90s, created multi-academy trusts. We've given them a very big chunk of our schools, 80% of secondary school. The land the schools sit on is owned by the local authorities, so still us, the taxpayers, but these schools, these trusts have a 125-year lease and they have a lot of power on the land. How are they going to use this land? Is it always in the interest of students and teachers and users? We do not always have the means to check this. And this is when the alarm bells are ringing. Because without control and regulation, there could be thriving corruption. Now, if you look at the way the buildings are built on this land, UK design for schools are Usually, when you have that vision of Hogwarts, the cliched version of UK schools, this is a private school sort of building. And obviously, I'm not talking about private schools today because they are very special and they only concern 7% of the student cohort. Today, I'm looking at state schools and the buildings and the land they sit on. State schools often have 1970s buildings that were built not always to last, but that were built to house many, many students. There is a new wave of school builds. They're contemporary design. As I said, they are very much influenced by corporate architecture. And then you have obviously church schools, but they have a different status as well. So I'm going to describe my impression on my first placement experience when I started teaching about the way the building was laid out. So for me, the corporate building was very much influenced by a similar type of building, and ironically, it's prison building. We have very many similarities between prison architecture and school architecture in the UK. We have what we call an inner courtyard with usually a roof, a glass roof. We have what we call a street, and we have corridors with lots of rooms coming around that courtyard. And this is inspired by an idea, the Big Brother surveillance idea. If you want to know more about it, check what panopticon means in architecture. It's a disciplinary concept brought to life in the form of a central observation tower placed within a circle of prison cells. So Jeremy Bentham was the English philosopher who devised the panopticon, and he wanted to be sure that the people in an institution would be constantly under surveillance, constantly seen, and they would behave, he hoped, better if they were constantly under observation. So this big brother type of architecture is used in prisons and in schools. And this is usually for very big institutions with either inmates or students in their thousands. The problem with that constant state of visibility is that it is very clever because you're constantly under observation, so you have to be constantly disciplined. And it's, according to Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher, it is a cruel, ingenious cage, and it creates a discipline blockade. So we are constantly observed and under control. And this inner courtyard is a very ancient architectural trait. It was already used by Roman architects in warmer climes. You have the inner courtyard, the patio where you obviously you could have a fountain in Roman villas, but on a bigger scale, if you want an idea of it, you would look at the British Museum, for instance. You have this, what used to be the inner courtyard that was covered with glass, and that became now the main center for the British Museum. So this is an architectural choice which is very Christian in a way. You're constantly under the eye of God, and it's the First Testament God, the one who is the punishing God. So there's religious undertones to that architectural choice. There's a strong morality emphasis and a complete control and surveillance. So these corporate schools that sometimes remind you of prison architecture, they also look from outside like office buildings or bank building. There is concrete, glass partition, and it's not homey, it's not welcoming, it's just very sterile and business minded. And I think it's quite relevant culturally to see that we model our schools the same way as prisons and banks or offices. It's a lack of humanity in the building, a lack of beauty. It's only functional, it's not creative, and it's soulless. And to me, it definitely mirrors the way we went with exams pressures, with this soulless rota learning. It's dehumanizing. This inner courtyard I mentioned is called the atrium, and it's a very old feature, but it's been used now in this sort of corporate architecture. And the public space is very much constantly under scrutiny and under the eye. So, as I said, you can see this atrium idea in the British Museum atrium, the Great Court, but you can also see it in prisons and very recent modern prisons and also in schools. There's bridges where people walk from the first floor that can overlook those below. And I've seen it in many schools. Bond Bryan Architects, for instance, with the contractor Wilmot Dixon, built a school in Hertfordshire with these common features, that big, huge public space they call the atrium, and where you can always be observed and seen. So, how do we improve these designs? Well, we are obviously going for very big schools, very big institutions with a lot of students in one space. We are doing it for cost. Maybe we're doing it for safety and safeguarding, but it's a big concentration of students, and it doesn't seem to be promoting humanity and creativity and warmth in these buildings. There's definitely a correlation between the school ethos and the building in the learning experience. The more we want to control, the more we want to observe and rule, and the more we build these glass partitions, and we do not spend any time thinking about the beauty of architecture for schools anymore. That beauty, you will see it in historical buildings, and usually they are used by private schools or church schools who have a very different setting. What I see in the way we use land and the way we design buildings in the UK is a lack of space inside the classroom, with lots of tables and chairs that are not fitting the bodies of the students. It's the same tables and chair for year 7 students to year 12 students, even though some are children and very little, and some are adults with adult bodies. We also do not have enough flexibility of use. We have a lack of sports facilities in state schools. As I said, there was a big push to make extra income. So we built and built over the land that was owned by the schools. We got rid of swimming pool in my local area. There used to be a swimming pool in the secondary school. I was told that students went there in the 70s and the 80s and they took swimming lessons, and now the swimming pool has been sold off and is used by private clubs for swimming. So it is a slow process in which land is built upon. All the structures are sometimes too small and inadequate for the users, but we keep building because we need more income, and it doesn't always serve the community or the main users, that is to say, the students. There's a lack of access to nature. And if there's grass, for instance, I know a local school nearby where the students are not allowed on the grass, because if they went on the grass, they would damage the grass. So the students are not allowed to walk on the grass. And there's no trees, no exposure to soil and nature and bark and the smells that are very, very useful to fight depression. Petrichor has been studied. It is a very good tool to fight mental illness and depression, and yet we do not provide it for our students in our current school. So this is quite a depressing um, landscape of the property and the land use in the UK as far as state school is concerned. We are having a very big movement towards privatization, and the resources are diminished and sold off at times. So this is a very big issue that we are facing at the moment. I'm going to try and play the news again, and hopefully they will work. Let me check. Um, because I'm conscious we haven't had the news. So let's try again. And then, nope. Apologize, dear listeners. It will be a news-free podcast today because I seem to have difficulties playing the news. I wanted to just summarize what I mentioned today. As I said, property in education is not a common theme, it's not a common topic. And I find it quite telling. I'll give you an example. We were talking about who has influence on school decisions during a meeting, and we were talking about the fact that it was the leadership and it was the governors, the head teacher, and members of SLT. And then we said, and who is living with these decisions? We said it was the teachers, it was the staff, the caretaker, the students, and by association, the parents and the local community. And yet, these people who are affected in their daily life, in the way the space and the land interact with their own mental health and their own physical health, these people do not have a say in the decision making. I did mention once that I found very strange the interconnected aspect between property agent and schools in the UK. And when I mentioned it, nobody reacted. And I thought that was very telling because these are people who have influence and it's people who are also making money out of the situation. And yet we don't want to seem to analyze what's going on and we are not looking at conflicts of interest. So I think it's really important to have this in mind because it's so ingrained, the idea of property. And when you look at the origin of the word, property is a quality, proper, what is acceptable, what is moral. And then there's ownership. And too often I think we might associate both. We have a generation of students coming into our schools now who will never be homeowners. They will never be able to own a property. And I think we need to have that in mind when we analyze the idea of property and when we think about land use in the UK. These young people are going to question this state of affair. The fact that 8% of UK land is owned by the taxpayers, the public, and that 17% of UK land is unrecorded. We do not know who owns it. And that 30% of the land is owned by the gentry and the aristocracy for hundreds of years. I think these questions are going to pop up in the near future more and more because these entail influence, power, and we have a movement of people who are going to question this because these decisions have been made, and the people who are living with the consequences are the students and the teachers. The fact that there's not enough land in schools to make playgrounds, to have fields, to play rugby or football, or to just plant trees or to have a vegetable patch, this affects our young people now. And these decisions affect their future. And I think it is really telling that this is not a topic that people mention when we talk about education. Property is a big issue, and yet in education, we see that the land is now given for 125 years to these academies that are very, very secretive. It's really hard to find data about academies. It's really hard to see if they were efficient in improving results. So we just gave them a lot of privileges, a lot of land, a lot of access to our young generation, and we don't know the long-term effects of having given them so much power. So when we talk about property in the UK, we talk about power and we talk about privilege and we talk about secrecy and lack of transparency. And I hope you found this interesting and that it gave you food for thought, and that you're going to ask questions about who owns the land, what is done with it, and what do we want our school land and our school buildings to look like in the next 10 years? Because I think a big change is coming. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to ask questions or give me your opinion on the podcast, please do use Twitter. My hashtag is at ProfProfMFL. All views are my own. Please give me your feedback. It will be much welcome and much appreciated. Thank you, dear listeners. I wish you a lovely week, and I'll see you next Sunday.